My walker hit the floor harder than I expected, the metal scraping across the tiles before it toppled near the doorway. The sound stopped me in place, not because of the noise, but because of the way my son's hand stayed in the air a moment too long after shoving it. I felt a small shift inside me, the quiet kind that comes when something familiar turns into something you don't recognize. He stood in front of me with his jaw tight, waiting for me to react. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't frustration. It was a test, and he wanted to watch me fail. He told me to stand without it, his voice low and steady, like he was giving an order instead of a suggestion. He said, "Show us you're not useless," and the word landed between us with a cold finality. I didn't move right away. Not because I couldn't, but because I was trying to understand why he suddenly needed me to prove something. His eyes weren't asking, they were measuring. That small detail unsettled me more than the words themselves. He had spoken to me with impatience before, but this was different. It wasn't until I looked past him that I understood the weight in the room. A young man stood by the wall holding up his phone, recording the entire moment. I recognized him from the last few visits, someone my son had introduced loosely as a friend helping with the house. The phone was angled toward me, not my son, and his expression didn't match curiosity, it carried expectation, like he was waiting for a certain kind of reaction. The sight of that phone changed the air between us. Suddenly the room wasn't just tense, it felt staged. My son stepped back slightly, giving the visitor a better view. The shift was small but intentional. He didn't offer his hand to help me. He didn't look at the walker he had pushed aside. He kept his eyes on me, daring me to move. My heart didn't race, but something inside me pulled tight. I had raised that man. I had taught him patience, steadiness, and how to speak with respect. Yet here he was, watching me like I was an object in his way. I tried to ease my weight onto the table behind me, and the visitor leaned in with a whisper that wasn't meant for my son. He said, "He told me you wouldn't fight back." The words weren't loud, but they were sharp enough to close whatever space was left in the room. I didn't look at him, but I heard every syllable. That whisper wasn't casual. It wasn't harmless. It was a hint of something planned, something rehearsed. I straightened slowly, steadying myself without the walker, and both of them watched with too much interest. My son folded his arms, pretending to look casual, but his shoulders stayed rigid. He wanted to see my limits. He wanted proof of them. The visitor kept recording, shifting his angle slightly as if documenting a task. The humiliation wasn't in falling or stumbling. It was in realizing their attention wasn't on my well-being. It was on capturing weakness. As I pushed myself upright, I felt the strain in my knees, but I didn't let the discomfort show. The room felt smaller now, not because of the walls, but because of the intent I could feel pressing from both sides. Their eyes weren't on me as a father or an old man. They were on me as something they needed to frame a certain way. I kept my breathing steady as I reached for the back of the chair to balance myself. My son didn't react, neither did the visitor. That stillness from both of them made my skin tighten. This moment wasn't about checking on me, or testing my recovery, or pushing me toward independence. It was about something else, something that needed to be seen through a phone lens. In that silence, something finally clicked into place. This wasn't just disrespect. It wasn't a bad day or a thoughtless outburst. It was connected to the missing mail, the sudden questions about my documents, the strange visits, and the pressure he'd been applying around the house. The push, the recording, the staging, none of it was random. I had stepped into something far bigger than a son's cruelty. I was standing in the doorway of a danger I wasn't supposed to recognize. I sat down after they left, letting the silence settle long enough for my thoughts to fall into place. Moments like that don't start on the day they happen. They grow from years you thought you understood, years you told yourself were normal, years you tried to forgive because they belonged to someone you loved. I'm in my late 70s now, and I've learned that the past doesn't disappear. It waits quietly until something forces you to face it. That push to my walker wasn't the beginning. It was the point where everything finally revealed itself. I raised my son alone after my wife died when he was still small. Back then, I worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on and food on the table. I'd leave before sunrise and return long after he'd fallen asleep, trying to be both present and absent in ways no parent should have to balance. I don't blame him for wanting more than I could give, but I saw the way responsibility sat on him even as a teenager. It never fit well. He wanted life to be easier, smoother, without the heaviness that comes from being needed. I ignored the signs for years, telling myself time would mature him. But as he grew older, so did his distance. Calls came less often. Holidays turned into quick visits. He rarely asked how I was managing. He asked about bills, insurance, the house, anything that tied back to money or property. I kept telling myself it was him trying to help, but the truth was simpler. He only appeared when paperwork was involved. Whenever life was smooth for him, he vanished. Whenever he was struggling, he remembered my address. The shift became clearer after my fall last year. I had slipped in the driveway and fractured my hip. It wasn't life-ending, but it was the kind of injury that makes people whisper about decline. My son's tone changed almost immediately. He didn't treat me with worry, he treated me with impatience. He began speaking slower, as if I couldn't follow. He sighed often, loud enough for me to hear. He told others how tough it was, taking care of an aging parent, though he rarely stayed long enough to offer any real care. Then he introduced the visitor, the young man who claimed he was helping with renovations. He called him a friend, someone handy who could fix up the place and get things ready for the future. I noticed the way they walked through rooms together, talking in low voices. They opened closets without asking. They measured walls I didn't want changed. They spoke about my home as if it were an empty structure waiting for new owners. The visitor smiled politely whenever I entered the room, but his eyes carried something colder, something that watched instead of acknowledged. It didn't stop there. My son started asking about medical forms, what doctor managed my prescriptions, whether I had updated my insurance, if my emergency contacts were current. He brought up power of attorney twice, casually, as if it was a normal topic for a man in my condition. He suggested I get ahead of things, so the family wouldn't struggle later. He didn't say what things meant. He didn't need to. He also asked more about my bank accounts in 1 month than he had in 20 years. He wanted to know if I'd listed beneficiaries. He wondered aloud who would handle decisions if I couldn't keep up. Each question seemed harmless alone, but together they formed a pattern I had tried not to see. A man doesn't suddenly become interested in legal documents unless he's preparing for something. I still remember the first moment a real fear took hold. He was sitting at my kitchen table, flipping through mail he had no reason to open, and he said, "We should get some paperwork sorted before anything happens." He said it calmly, as if planning ahead. But I heard something else underneath, something calculated. That was the first time I asked myself, quietly and without emotion, why are they preparing legal documents around me? I started noticing the smallest things first, the kinds of details most people would overlook unless they were already uneasy. My medication box sat on the counter the same way it always had, each slot labeled by day, each dose counted out carefully. But one morning, Tuesday's pills were gone even though I knew I hadn't taken them. Thursday's section was shifted slightly, pushed a little farther open than the rest. I stood there staring at the box, trying to replay my steps from the night before. I don't misplace things like that. At my age, routines aren't just habits, they're survival. Someone had moved it. Someone had checked something. Someone had touched what wasn't theirs. Later that afternoon, I walked into the living room and noticed the armchair angled differently, facing more toward the hallway. The side table beside it had a faint mark where something heavy had been dragged. A drawer I hadn't opened in months was left ajar, just enough to notice from across the room. None of these things were dramatic, but they were wrong in ways only the person who lived there every day would recognize. My home has always been predictable. These were disruptions, small cracks forming in places I used to trust. My son came by later and told me I should take a week at a care facility for observation. He said the doctor might want to check for mental fatigue. Using a tone that tried to sound caring but didn't hide the impatience underneath, I asked which doctor suggested it. He changed the subject. When I said I preferred to stay home, he looked disappointed, not worried, not frustrated, but disappointed, as if my refusal inconvenienced something he had planned. That expression lingered in my mind long after he left. The visitor started showing up more often, too. At first, he knocked. Then he didn't. He moved around the house with a confidence that didn't match his role. I would find him in the hallway, in the basement near my study, each time with the same excuse, just checking on repairs. He carried his phone everywhere, always at chest level, always angled toward me or the room behind me. He wasn't fixing anything. He wasn't even pretending well. He was observing. The first concrete confirmation came the day I bent down to pick up a piece of paper near the edge of the dining table. It was folded, then crushed, then smoothed out again. When I opened it, a bold title stared up at me, Capability Assessment. Below it were blank fields for signatures and checkboxes describing levels of independence. I hadn't printed it. I hadn't requested anything like it. The date in the corner was from last week. Someone had filled out part of it lightly with pencil, enough to leave faint marks. I didn't recognize the handwriting. My fingers tightened around the page before I slid it quietly into my pocket. That evening, my son returned with a stack of papers clipped together. He called them routine home care paperwork, the kind everyone my age supposedly signs, though I'd never heard of any such requirement from my doctor. He pushed the forms toward me and said it would help him help me. He kept tapping the signature line as if that would convince me. I asked what the forms were for. He answered too quickly. I asked again. He didn't answer the second time. He just said, "Dad, don't make this difficult." I didn't sign anything. After he left, I began keeping quiet notes. A small notebook tucked in my nightstand, nothing more than short lines marking dates, times, and details, missing pills, shifted furniture, unexpected visits, strange papers. I didn't know yet what the notes would amount to, but I knew enough to recognize that these weren't isolated incidents. Patterns don't appear by accident. They form when someone repeats themselves. Each entry added a little more weight to the unease already growing inside me. Something was happening inside my home, step by step, detail by detail. Enough for me to stop doubting myself, and enough for me to start paying attention with the kind of vigilance I should have used much earlier. I decided to start with the one person who would give me a straight answer. The next morning, I called my doctor's office and asked if they had requested any kind of capability assessment or care facility observation for me. The nurse on the line checked my file twice, even asked another staff member to confirm. When she came back, her voice carried a clear certainty. No assessments had been ordered, no concerns had been filed, and no paperwork had been requested on my behalf. She sounded surprised I would even ask. I thanked her, but the confirmation settled into me like a cold stone. Whatever my son had been presenting as doctor's orders came from somewhere else entirely. That same afternoon, I noticed something new on my front door. The lock, which I had replaced last year, had fresh scratches around the keyhole, thin, uneven marks that didn't match normal wear. It looked like someone had tried different keys or tested something small and metallic against it. I ran my thumb along the edge and felt a faint burr where the metal had scraped. I live alone. No one else has permission to enter. Those scratches didn't belong there, and they weren't old enough to ignore. I walked back inside and let my eyes adjust to the dim light in the living room. I had been paying attention to small details for weeks now, but this time something caught my eye near the vent above the bookshelf. A tiny reflection, barely more than a pinprick of light, trembled when I shifted my angle. I pulled a chair over and climbed up carefully, holding onto the shelf as I inspected it. Behind the slits of the vent, tucked deep enough to avoid notice, was the glassy circle of a small camera lens. No wires dangled out, no visible mount. It looked like it had been placed with precision. I stepped down slowly, feeling the controlled fear settle through my body with a clarity I hadn't felt before. Before I could gather my thoughts, the doorbell rang. The visitor stood there again, holding a screwdriver and a thin smile. He said he was checking on a loose hinge in the hallway. Though I hadn't reported anything of the sort, I didn't invite him in, but he stepped past me with the same casual confidence as always. He moved quickly, as if he knew exactly where he wanted to go, and paused only when he realized I was watching him more closely than usual. He muttered something about helping out, before retreating toward the basement. His presence now felt less like help and more like surveillance. Later that evening, my son called and mentioned, without hesitation, that he had installed a security camera for my protection. He sounded proud of himself, as if he had done me a favor. I didn't tell him I'd already found it. I didn't tell him the discovery felt nothing like safety. He explained that he needed to keep an eye on things, since I lived alone, and that I would get used to it. His tone was firm, rehearsed, and final. I ended the call without arguing, but my silence wasn't agreement. It was calculation. The next morning I found my mail on the table, but the envelopes didn't look untouched. The edges were lifted slightly, as if peeled open and resealed with careful pressure. One letter concerned my pension. Another detailed changes in state benefits. Both had been folded in ways that didn't match how mail usually arrived. I felt the edges again, noticing the faint stickiness where the glue had broken and reattached. Whatever was inside had already been read by someone else. With each detail compounding the last, I decided to call the bank. I asked them to check whether anyone had attempted access to my online accounts. After a brief wait, the representative confirmed multiple unsuccessful login attempts over the past month, attempts that weren't mine. She asked if I wanted to reset my credentials. I said yes, but the confirmation did nothing to calm the weight in my chest. Someone had been trying to get inside my financial life the same way they were trying to get inside my home. By the time I hung up, the pattern was no longer subtle. Every irregularity, every intrusion, every shift in behavior pointed in the same direction. Someone was preparing something around me, not through threats or yelling, but through quiet steps, hidden entries, and silent access attempts. And wherever this was leading, it wasn't meant for my benefit. He came to me late in the afternoon, moving more carefully than usual, as if he wasn't sure he should even be there. I was sitting at the kitchen table sorting my notes when I heard a hesitant knock, soft, not the confident tapping he normally used when walking into my home without asking. When I opened the door, the visitor stood on the porch with his hood up and his eyes unfocused, like someone carrying a weight he didn't know how to hold. He asked if we could talk somewhere private. His voice didn't match the smugness he usually wore, and that difference alone made my pulse slow with caution. I stepped aside, letting him in, watching how he kept glancing toward the windows. He sat across from me but didn't meet my eyes at first. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from conflict. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it between us without turning the screen on. He said he needed to show me something, but that I had to stay calm. Men my age don't react loudly, we react with stillness. So I nodded. He unlocked the phone, opened a video file, and set it on the table, angling the screen toward me with a kind of reluctant dread. The clip began with a familiar voice. My son's, speaking in a low, controlled tone. He wasn't angry. He wasn't stressed. He spoke like someone outlining a plan he had already accepted. He said, "Once we declare him incompetent, things will move fast." The words hit harder than the walker hitting the floor days earlier. In the background of the video I could see my living room, the same chair they had shifted, the same layout I knew by heart. My son stood with a stack of papers on the table behind him. He tapped them with his finger. "The house sells first," he continued. "We'll split what we need once the signatures go through." The visitor kept his eyes on me as I watched, as if waiting for something to break in my expression. Nothing did. The clip kept playing, and my son's voice stayed steady. He mentioned getting it done before summer and making sure he can't revoke anything. These weren't casual statements. They were steps in a process, rehearsed and deliberate. I felt something slow and cold press against my ribs. Not panic, but the kind of clarity that arrives when denial finally loses its grip. The visitor stopped the clip before it ended and looked away, rubbing the side of his face. He said my son had promised him money for helping document weakness. That was the phrase he used, document weakness. He said he was told to record moments where I looked confused, tired, or unsteady. Moments like the walker. Moments where a slight stumble could be framed as decline. He said he didn't think much of it at first, that he thought it was just for safety records. But when the tone changed, when the talk turned to selling the house and transferring accounts, he understood what he had become part of. Before I could respond, he opened another clip. This one wasn't filmed inside my home. It was in a car, my son sitting in the passenger seat, practicing lines the way someone rehearses for a play. He tried different phrases. "Dad, I'm worried you're slipping. Let's get your memory checked. You forgot the keys again." Each line was calm, designed to sound caring to someone who didn't know better. He repeated them until they sounded natural, until they sounded real. The visitor paused the video and leaned closer. His voice lowered into the same tone he had used when he whispered to me during the Walker incident. But this time, the words were different. "They want legal control," he said. "Not care, control." There was no hesitation, no attempt to soften it. I sat back, letting the truth settle into my bones. It wasn't hypothetical. It wasn't beginning. It was already in motion. The paperwork, the recordings, the staged moments, they weren't experiments. They were steps in a plan already far along its path. The illusion that my son's actions came from frustration or stress finally cracked, and what lay underneath was colder than I expected. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't bitterness. This was preparation, and I was the only one who wasn't meant to see it. I called Adult Protective Services the next morning, using the number printed on the back of a brochure the hospital once handed me after my fall. I had never imagined needing it. When the caseworker answered, I kept my voice steady and explained that I had recordings showing my son discussing declaring me incompetent. I did not add emotion. I gave details the way a man gives facts he has already accepted. She asked me to upload the files through their secure portal, and I did it while she stayed on the line. The silence that followed, the few minutes she took to review them, felt longer than it was. When she returned, her tone had changed. It wasn't sympathy, it was concern sharpened by recognition. She said the footage aligned with known patterns of financial and medical coercion, planned incompetency claims, documented evidence, collected without consent, and staged interactions to portray decline. She listed them slowly, checking each off the way a doctor might diagnose something serious. I didn't need her to explain further. Hearing it stated plainly by someone who had seen these cases before removed any remaining doubt. She told me an officer would contact me shortly to discuss immediate safety steps. Her professionalism didn't hide the urgency under her words. An officer called within the hour, arranging to meet me at the community center instead of my home. When we sat down in the small office, he asked direct questions about my finances, access codes, and recent unusual behavior. I answered each one carefully. He didn't react to any single detail: missing pills, open mail, hidden camera, attempted entry, scratches, but he wrote each of them down. When I mentioned the bank login attempts, he paused long enough to confirm what I already sensed I needed to secure every account connected to my name. He advised me to update passwords in person at the bank, place an alert on my credit file, and convert all medical access into in-person verification only. He said it plainly, without dramatics. Someone is preparing to act on your behalf without your permission. The weight of that statement was clear enough. I told him I understood. Later that day, I made an appointment with my doctor for a full cognitive evaluation, not because I doubted my mind, but because I needed an official record. The tests were simple: memory recall, reasoning questions, orientation checks. When he finished, he sat across from me with the professionalism I had always trusted in him. He He said my results were strong, consistent, and showed no sign of cognitive impairment. He typed the report immediately and printed it with his signature and license number. Then he slid the folder across the desk and said, "Whatever's going on, this will protect you." His tone told me he suspected more than I said. APS contacted me again the following morning. They had reviewed more of the recordings and the timeline I provided. They flagged my son's behavior as a potential attempt to compromise my legal autonomy, language they used carefully, avoiding anything that sounded like accusation. They said they would begin a formal file but needed me to avoid confrontation until more evidence was collected. They emphasized that predators often escalate when they sense resistance. "Do not tell him what you know," the caseworker said. "Not yet." I sat with that instruction for a long moment after the call ended. The quiet in my home felt different now, not the discomfort of suspicion, but the clarity of confirmed threat. The plan wasn't forming, it was already underway. The paperwork, the staged videos, the pressure, the lies, they weren't parts of a conflict between father and son. They were steps in a strategy meant to take control of my life piece by piece. By the end of the day, I realized something simple and heavy. I had crossed into a place where there was no returning to old assumptions, no pretending this was a misunderstanding, no hoping it would resolve on its own. The point of no return had arrived, and I had no choice but to move forward with my eyes fully open. I met with APS again 2 days later in a small office at the community center. The caseworker listened as I gave updates, then outlined the next step with a calm certainty that told me they had handled situations like mine many times before. She said the safest way to move forward was to invite my son to a meeting, somewhere neutral, so they could observe and intervene if needed. An officer sitting beside her added that the invitation had to sound natural, not forced or defensive. They needed him to believe nothing had changed. I nodded, understanding the weight of what they were asking without arguing against it. A man my age doesn't fight battles directly anymore. He prepares quietly. When I called my son that afternoon, I kept my tone steady. I told him we should talk about the paperwork he'd been pushing toward me. The line went silent for a moment before he asked why I had changed my mind. I said only that I wanted to get it over with. He accepted the answer too quickly, his relief coming through in his voice even though he tried to hide it. I suggested we meet at the building where the security office was, the same place he had pushed my walker aside days before. He agreed, eager in a way that confirmed exactly what the authorities suspected. Over the next 24 hours, his behavior shifted again. He called repeatedly, each time more impatient than the last. He wanted to know if I still had the house keys organized the same way. He asked where I kept my medical files. He questioned whether I had opened any new mail without telling him. His tone wasn't caring, it was probing. He sounded like someone making sure nothing had slipped out of his grasp. I answered his questions calmly, giving him nothing more than short confirmations or vague replies. I didn't challenge him. I didn't ask why he needed any of it. Pretending compliance requires a kind of stillness I didn't know I was capable of anymore. But the officers had been clear: avoid confrontation, avoid suspicion, avoid escalation. Let him believe he was still in control. It took effort to keep my voice even each time he pressed for something that was no longer his to touch. After each call, I returned to the folder I had been building quietly for weeks. I printed transcripts of the recordings the visitor had shown me. I collected the screenshots from my bank showing failed login attempts. I added photographs of the scratched lock, the hidden camera, the open mail. I organized everything in chronological order, making it clear, clean, impossible to distort. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a steady heaviness settle in my chest. Not fear, not anger, but the weight of truth arranged on paper. The officers met me early on the day of the meeting. They walked me through the building, showing me where they would stand, how they would stay out of sight until needed, and where the APS investigator would wait. Their presence wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was steady, quiet, and prepared. They told me I wouldn't be alone for a single moment. Their calmness gave me something stronger than reassurance. It gave me clarity. Late that afternoon, my son called again. This time he didn't try to hide the urgency. He said we needed to sign everything tonight. That delaying would cause problems. He pressed the point 3 different ways, each one sharper than the last. I let him speak until he ran out of arguments. Then I simply said, "We'll talk when we meet." He didn't like the answer. I heard it in the silence that followed. When I hung up, I sat quietly at my kitchen table and rested my hand on the folder. The house around me felt calm, the kind of calm that comes just before something shifts. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crumbling. I wasn't imagining worst-case scenarios. I was preparing to face what was already real. By the time I stood to get ready, the heaviness inside me had settled into something sharper, controlled, measured, and unwavering. I knew what waited in that meeting room. I knew what truth needed to be exposed, and I knew I was finally ready to face it. I walked beside my son down the hallway, keeping my pace steady, letting him believe this meeting was exactly what he wanted. He carried a manila folder under his arm, tapping it lightly against his leg like a man eager to seal a deal. I told him the security office had a private room we could use to clarify the forms. He didn't question it. He didn't even look around. His focus stayed on me, confident, impatient, certain I was finally about to give him what he'd been pushing for. When I opened the door to the security room, he stepped in first, expecting an empty table and a quick signature. Instead, he froze. The APS investigator stood near the far wall, arms at her sides, her expression unreadable. Two officers were positioned beside the monitor, their presence silent but unmistakable. My son's grip on his folder tightened, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something break across his face, confusion, then irritation, then something close to fear. I closed the door behind us without saying a word. The investigator gestured to the chairs. My son didn't sit. He looked at me like I had betrayed him somehow, then turned toward the officers. "What is this?" he demanded, trying to sound offended, not nervous. The officer closest to him simply said, "We're here to review some information." His tone was calm, professional, and impossible to argue with. The screen came to life, and the first clip played, the rehearsed lines he practiced in the car, each one designed to paint me as a man slipping mentally. My son's jaw clenched. He said the footage was taken out of context. He insisted it was a joke, a misunderstanding, a private conversation. The officer didn't respond. He moved on to the next clip. The scene of my living room appeared. My son stood by the table with the stack of documents, explaining how declaring me incompetent would speed things up. He mentioned selling the house quickly once the signatures went through. He talked about timing and avoiding delays. His voice in the video was steady, confident, and unfiltered. My son took a step forward now, shaking his head, saying the video must be edited. He pointed at me and said I was misremembering things, that I had been confused for months. He said he was trying to help me keep things organized. The APS investigator didn't let him continue. She placed a folder on the table, a sealed medical competence report from my doctor. She summarized it briefly, my memory intact, my reasoning strong, no signs of cognitive impairment. My son stopped talking. The shift in the room was immediate. His excuse evaporated before it could take shape. The officer then brought up the photos, screenshots of failed login attempts on my accounts, timestamps from the security system, images of the hidden camera lens behind the vent. He didn't accuse. He simply laid out the evidence in a clean sequence, fact after fact, each one closing a door my son might have used to escape. When the officer showed the bank access logs matching my son's device ID, my son's breathing changed. His confidence thinned into something jagged. He tried again, reaching for anger now. He claimed he installed the camera for my safety. He said he had been trying to protect me from myself. The investigator cut through his words with a single question. "Then why did you request competency forms behind his back?" My son's mouth opened, but no answer came out. He looked at me, searching for sympathy, then at the officers, searching for an exit neither of them offered. When the final clip played, the one showing him instructing the visitor to capture moments of weakness, my son's shoulders fell. Whatever structure he had built around his lies collapsed in seconds. His voice cracked, not with remorse, but with frustration at being cornered. He said the recordings were illegal. He said this was all a setup. He said anything except the truth. The room stayed silent until the investigator spoke. She said calmly, "We have enough to proceed." My son's eyes darted between us, his composure gone, replaced with the realization that the control he thought he had was never real. Not here, not now. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already on the screen, and every lie he tried to stand on had already crumbled beneath him. APS filed their report before the sun even set that evening. The investigator didn't dramatize the process. She moved through each step with quiet precision, reading the statements, cataloging the evidence, and entering it into the system. She spoke to me only when necessary, her tone steady, her questions focused. When she finally folded the file shut, she told me the case would proceed under attempted elder coercion and financial exploitation. Hearing those words applied to my own son didn't shock me. I had already crossed that threshold earlier. Still, the finality of it pressed into me like a weight I knew I'd carry long after the paperwork was done. The officers informed my son he was barred from entering my property, accessing my accounts, or contacting me in any form. They didn't raise their voices or tighten their expressions. They simply stated the boundaries with the authority of men who had done this many times before. My son's reaction wasn't outrage, it was disbelief. He looked at each of us, as if waiting for the moment someone would change their mind. No one did. They walked him out of the building without touching him. But the distance they kept made it clear he had crossed a line he could not step back over. The visitor, the young man who had shown me the recordings, was escorted separately. He didn't protest, he didn't meet my eyes. Officers guided him into a side room for a formal witness protection interview. His cooperation didn't absolve him, but it placed him on a different path than my son. As he disappeared behind the door, I felt a mix of gratitude and sadness, gratitude that he'd eventually told the truth, sadness that he'd been part of something that forced my hand in ways I never wanted. Once the building emptied, the officer assigned to my case walked me home. He didn't make conversation. He didn't try to soften anything. He unlocked my door with the temporary key the locksmith had installed earlier that day. All my locks were replaced, new deadbolts, reinforced frames, and a fresh security code that only APS and I knew. My medical access was changed too. Every portal, login, and authorization now required in-person verification with proof of identity. Necessary protections, but protections that reminded me of how fragile my autonomy had become. My house looked the same, but it didn't feel like the same place. Safety has a way of feeling heavier than danger when it arrives after a long period of denial. I walked through each room slowly, noticing the faint remnants of intrusion, the places where drawers had been disturbed, the vent where the hidden camera had rested, the shadows of footsteps that didn't belong to me. They were gone now, but the memory of their presence lingered. Word of the incident traveled quietly through the family. My cousin called first, her voice stiff as she said she heard something happened. She didn't ask if I was all right. She asked if it was true. Another relative messaged me once, a short sentence saying she didn't believe my son meant it like that. After that, silence followed. No one came by. No one offered support. Distance became the easiest way for them to avoid choosing sides. I didn't resent them for it, but I recognized the pattern. People pull back from situations that force them to face uncomfortable truths about someone they thought they knew. In the quiet of my living room, I sat down and let the weight finally settle. I wasn't angry. I wasn't relieved. I felt the kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from realizing someone you raised had been preparing to take everything from you, not out of necessity, but out of calculation. The wound wasn't sharp, it was dull and deep, the kind that would ache long after the danger passed. But beneath the heaviness, a quieter understanding took shape. Safety had returned, not by luck, not by confrontation, but by facing the truth head-on. It came at a cost measured not in money or property, but in the loss of something far more personal. Yet it was necessary. Some truths protect you only after they break you. I spent the weeks after the investigation rebuilding my life in small, steady steps. Not out of fear, but out of a quiet need to reclaim control. I reorganized the house room by room, taking back the spaces that had been used without my consent. I moved my important documents into a locked drawer only I could access. I changed every password, every PIN, every place where trust had been assumed instead of earned. My routines became tighter, not rigid, just clear. Boundaries at my age aren't walls, they're anchors. They keep you steady when the people around you start shifting. In the still moments of early morning, I found myself thinking about how betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it wears a familiar face. Sometimes it speaks in the same tone you once trusted. It doesn't knock, it slips in through small gaps. Missing pills, open mail, gentle suggestions that don't feel dangerous until they do. I had spent years believing my son's distance was circumstance, not intention. But age teaches you that danger often hides in the spaces where love used to live. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me aware. If there's wisdom in surviving something like this, it's simple and practical. Verify everything. Don't assume a signature line is harmless. Don't let anyone rush you into decisions about your health, your home, or your future. Keep your documents organized, not because you expect trouble, but because clarity is protection. Trust slowly, even with family. Especially with family if their behavior starts shifting in ways that don't match their words. Love and caution can exist in the same breath. Age teaches you how to balance both without apology. Sometimes I think about the irony of how all this unfolded. My son's plan relied on recording me, capturing moments of weakness, staging scenes, building a file he thought would paint a picture of decline. But those same recordings, the ones he pressured others to make, became the evidence that protected me. His attempt to create proof of incompetence ended up proving his own intentions instead. Life has a way of turning the truth toward the one who tries to hide it. I have a quiet appreciation now for the people who stepped in when they didn't have to. The officers who walked through my door with professionalism instead of pity. The APS investigator who handled every detail without ever making me feel small. Even the visitor, young, uncertain, caught in something he didn't fully understand, who chose honesty before things went too far. I don't owe him trust, but I do acknowledge the part he played. Sometimes the truth comes from unexpected places. With time, the fear faded into something softer. Not forgiveness, but understanding. I don't pretend the wound isn't there, but I don't let it guide me either. There is peace in knowing I acted before losing control of my life. Peace in knowing the truth didn't stay buried. Peace in knowing I didn't let exhaustion or hope blind me to what was happening in my own home. I protected what I had built, what I had worked for, what I had spent a lifetime maintaining. Age carves lessons into you whether you ask for them or not. Mine is this: your dignity is worth defending, even quietly. Your autonomy is worth guarding, even from the people who believe they deserve it more than you. Vigilance isn't fear, it's self-respect. And strength in your later years doesn't come from how loudly you fight, but from how clearly you see. In the end, you learn to stand your ground not because you expect danger behind every door, but because you finally understand that your life is yours to protect, no matter who tries to claim it.